Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Ruby Rogues Podcast. This week on our panel, we have Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
John Epperson.
Hello.
Luke Stutters.
Hi.
And Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Just a quick shout out. Go check out the MVP or most valuable programmer stuff that I'm putting together. It's devchat.tv/MVP. This week, we have a special guest, and that is Eric Hayes. Eric, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Eric. I've been a programmer in some fashion for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, but started working with Ruby and Rails probably around 2007. And yeah, I worked for a school district for 10 years where I did all kinds of things, but one of which was build apps for teachers. And then I did a stint at Red Hat for about a year. And now I work for a small company. I'm the CTO of a small company that builds donor analytics for nonprofit orgs like churches.
Oh, nice. Leveling up is important. I spend at least an hour every day learning ways I can improve my business or take a break and listen to a good book. If you're looking to level up, I recommend you start out with the 12-week year as a system to plan out where you want to end up and how to get the results you want. You can get it free by going to audibletrial.com/code. That's audibletrial.com/code. Yeah, well, we brought you on to talk about Arel or Arel. I've heard it's...
I think it's Arel.
I think it's Arel is the way that I've heard it from the Rails people. But yeah, it's always interesting to hear a little bit of that background. School district and then, nonprofits.
Yeah.
That's interesting
all over the place.
Too. Yeah. So, but let's dive in here. So why Arel? I mean, people mostly just use the Rails ActiveRecord stuff, right?
Right.
And I think it wraps over the top of it.
Yeah.
So why do we care? It's just it's a little layer that I don't have to think about, right?
Right. Most of the time you're working in ActiveRecord, and I remember the first time I saw ActiveRecord and I was like, man, this is awesome, because I was coming from PHP and all that kind of stuff. So this isn't about how ActiveRecord is broken or wrong or something, but there are definitely instances where you need to drop down and work directly with the database. And my app is a reporting app, and so we use a lot of database specific features, aggregations. We do a lot of calculations and processing in the database. And if you're going to do that, at least today, you have to drop down to SQL. There are some things where ActiveRecord over the years has added these fancier features, but for the most part, you have to drop down to SQL if you're going to really make use of some of these more powerful features.
Now, I guess before we get started, I want to ask a question around this, because writing SQL on a day-to-day basis within my Rails application does not sound like fun. It sounds very messy. Specifically messy, coming back to either refactor or to modify that line of SQL. It kind of reminds me of like Perl. You can at one point like write it and then maybe in the future read it, but it's not exactly something that you want to do, at least in my opinion. So would a alternative to using Arel be using a database view table where you have all the calculations that's happening on the database side and you can then just interact with it like a regular ActiveRecord object?
Yes, absolutely. So there's actually a cool gem called Scenic, and it helps you manage these database views and materialized views, where basically you have a SQL file and it says, hey, database, pretend this query is like a permanent table. And, there's various ways to update that data. But then when as far as the database is concerned, it's just a table, then you can totally just, as far as ActiveRecord knows, it's just like any of the other tables, and then you can have that nice, clean ActiveRecord interface. And I would say oftentimes, no matter what you do, in order to get to where you have that maintainability, the way I like to talk to our devs about it is we're always trying to push back to vanilla Rails, right? Even if we're doing something fancy, let's try to make our objects look like ActiveRecord objects when it's appropriate, or try to use the same controller view patterns and all that kind of stuff. Don't step too far out of that. But yeah, to your question, if you're dealing with a lot of SQL and you have strings and stuff, here's how I would say it. The ActiveRecord is like the starting point. Then, okay, I've got something fancier. That's where you decide, would something like a materialized view work for me? For our application is like a report. You can think of it as a reporting app. It's like a reporting app as a service almost kind of thing. And so our users can change the filters and settings, imagine a very complex search thing where they can just change stuff on the fly. And that's where materialized view stops being so beneficial, because materialized view is kind of like a denormalization, right? It's like you have your tables, they're all separate, posts and comments, and then you kind of want to put them together into like, here's a closer representation of what I'm going to show to my end user. And I'm going to kind of put that data together so it's fast. But we have a whole lot of data, and we have a multi-tenant kind of situation where we have different accounts, and then they can all change these settings and stuff. So just for our application, the kind of the raw data that we get from the customer is there are opportunities for us to do these kind of cache tables or something like a materialized view, but there's not a lot of places where that makes sense for us. And so we build that on the fly often with complex SQL, because we don't know ahead of time. Often we don't know ahead of time what the user is looking for. And so then we try to cache it closer to the end user, if that makes sense, instead of in the database. But the materialized view thing is totally cool. And if you could do it, that's actually probably better than what we do, but doesn't work out so well for us. We've looked.
I want to press pause here real quick, because we've used a couple of terms.
Yes.
Assumed that people know what they are.
I don't know what materialized view means. Help.
Yes. Materialized view. I don't think we really even mentioned what Arel is.
Yeah.
I think people, to some degree, if they're working in Rails and they've had to mess with the database at all, they at least have an idea of what SQL is.
Yeah.
Even if they haven't had to, write SQL or bash their head against the wall or anything else equally painful.
Yeah.
So we just define some of these terms: SQL, Arel, and materialized views?
Absolutely, yeah. So SQL is the language you talk to typical relational database today, and that's just it's a language that says, here's the data, here's how I want the data to look as it comes back out. It's like that's a whole show in itself of what SQL could be, but that's how you talk to the database and say, put my tables and do this with the data and give me this result. And so take that in your mind. And so then a view is like, okay, database, I want to store this special SQL that I've kind of put together and pretend the results are just like any other table. And so what the database does with that is your application might hit this like fake table. It's like a pseudo table almost. And behind the scenes, the database, okay, I'm going to run this query against the real tables and put it together and present it as if it was any other table in the database.
For me, the way that I think about it is essentially people are pretty familiar with the idea of indices in SQL tables, right? So every time you add something to the table, it updates the index. And so it keeps a running list, essentially. It's a B tree, but we don't need to go into that.
Yeah.
It keeps a running list of how to quickly order whatever it is that you have out of the table, right? And so every time you add something in, it updates the index. Well, it's the same thing, except it's essentially keeping a separate copy of the results of whatever query you would make.
Right. That's specifically what a materialized view is.
Yes.
Where like it's actually storing that somewhere. Yep. And then
it makes it really fast. And so if you're doing reporting and things like that, which is what we were talking about, it makes that real fast because it doesn't have to go grind through the data and say, okay, sort it by this and then partition it by this and then do this other thing with it and then twist it around this way and then squeeze it out through this round tube.
Exactly. Yeah. So where we're like, maybe the materialized view doesn't work for us is that we would have to update that so often that it might as well just be doing it on the fly as needed.
Yeah, your reports are custom queries, and so you can't just save it that way.
Yeah, but if your app does, you should absolutely go to that first before you're going to maybe build the complex stuff that we might talk about later. So yeah, I think we defined all of those.
And Arel.
Arel is what ActiveRecord uses under the hood to build SQL code, right? So Arel takes your post.find1 and turns that into select star from posts where ID equals 1, right? So it's at a basic high level, it's kind of like a translator, but we could get into more of kind of how it actually works, which is interesting to me at least. It was one of those things, when I first heard about Arel, I was like, man, that's deep computer sciencey kind of stuff, I wonder if I'll ever understand that, and then after I got a couple of kind of key concepts, it's like, oh, okay, this makes total sense. The other thing I should say real quick is that Arel also, it's the like compatibility layer where you could write the same active record for a dozen different databases, and Arel will kind of figure out, okay, what's the like Postgres specific lingo here? What's the MySQL specific lingo here? What about Microsoft SQL Server? There's a whole list of different databases that Rails supports, and it can do that in a sane way because of the Arel library.
Right. It's the jQuery for databases.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it's like let's build an abstraction layer over all the weirdnesses that the browsers, would do, and make JavaScript nice, and at least until everyone comes together and and agrees on how it should be.
Yeah, standardizes.
Yeah,
I'm not holding my breath for databases.
Yeah, that's right.
It's probably worth saying that the materialized views don't auto-update. So one of the reasons they're fast is it runs the query once, and then it does it sit on the disk? Presumably, it must sit on the disk somewhere.
I think it's stored just like any other database, and it's kind of up to you to keep it up to date. That's why it didn't make a ton of sense for us, because we'd be constantly thrashing that table, so to speak.
I was going to say, then you're maintaining all of those triggers and so many other things, which is its own thing.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. So we got this all defined. So Dave asked, why, Eric? Why?
Why not strings is probably a good thing to focus on. Like, why not just use strings? So you're like, okay, I can't just use ActiveRecord. I need to write raw SQL. Why not just use strings and do it the PHP style, which I think someone said. And that's totally valid. And the way I would say it is, if you have one or two cases where it's like, I got to drop down to SQL and I've got this very optimized thing that I'm running, then a string probably makes a ton of sense. But where strings become less of a good thing is when you have a lot of them and you have to worry about maintainability. And then when you're building SQL, especially if you're like going to combine different things, you got to keep track of when you write a SQL query, it's asking for columns and table names, and you got to keep all those straight. If you have a big blob of text in a string, and maybe you have some variables in there to make it do what you want, and you got to keep a bunch of stuff straight that Arel could do for you. And probably the main selling point for dropping down for using Arel instead of just strings is the composability, where you can you can have separate classes that kind of get combined into one structure in Arel without going into the details. And then Arel will figure out, okay, he's asking for these columns from this part and these columns from this other part, and I'm going to keep it all straight, and then the output is correct. That might not have made too much sense over pure audio, but...
Does SQL seem like an angry language to you?
Yes. Maybe not angry, but dense. It's like...
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
because you're used to doing all this lovely JavaScript, friendly Ruby, and even C#. It's not so bad. And then you get the kind of really stern languages like Objective-C, where everything's capitalized and it feels a bit formal. And then SQL comes in, and it's kind of like, select all, star.
It's very loud because it's often capitalized. Yeah, it's like shouting.
You guys do know that you don't have to capitalize it, right?
Yeah.
John is such a rebel.
Actually, I like the capitalized stuff. I think it looks prettier, so that's what I do.
I do.
John is such a conformist.
Yeah. I do it most of the time so I can keep different terms straight. But yeah, it's like with a language like Ruby or JavaScript, you're saying, here's what I want to do. Like, I'm starting with some data and here's what I want to do. I'm going to go through some like loops and, have some control, some if else kind of stuff. And then I kind of imagine what will come out the other end of my code. Whereas SQL is all about the part that comes out the other end. It's like, here's what I want it to look like, database, and you go figure it out how to make it happen. And so it's a different way of thinking for sure.
I think that's an important point to reiterate, because I was going to make it if no one ever got to that. It's like in SQL, you're not telling the database what to do. You are describing to the database the data set and how you want it arranged. Right. And the database then says, how do I grab this data? Let me figure this out. And it does all that for you.
Right, which is a complete paradigm shift, probably for most people.
I thought I was the boss.
One thing I should say, like what unlocked it for me was this concept called a CTE, or I'm blanking on what that means, common table expression. And that's one of the reasons why we dropped down to Arel, to use Arel, is because then we can work with this thing called a CTE. But you can think of a CTE as a more object-oriented way of thinking about SQL, or at least that's how I think about it, where you can say, okay, I'm just going to start with step one like one transformation, and then I'm going to add another one and another one. And at the end, I'll just have like a really simple select from this thing I've kind of built up from top to bottom. Whereas otherwise, a lot of complex SQL has like these nested statements, and it's not very easy to read or reason about. But if people are interested in kind of getting deeper into SQL, I recommend looking into this idea called a CTE, or common table expression, because that kind of unlocked it for me. It's like, okay, now I can like think step by step how I'm transforming stuff, and then kind of get the output at the end. It gets it a little closer to regular languages, if you will.
They're super powerful. And you suddenly found yourself reaching for CTEs. Yeah. And now you couldn't write that because it is a thing that ActiveRecord doesn't natively support. Right. You now were like, now I need to write this in Arel, whatever it is.
Exactly, yeah. And that also helps us. So we do a lot of taking, how do I explain this? So we have the kind of reports that we're showing that are like, let's just say there's a handful of common transformations that might come from, or that might be shared across multiple reports, right? So we have a place there where we can reuse some code, right? And so our query objects, as we call them, that wrap some Arel are small, discrete pieces that we can mix and match for the final report that we're trying to build, the final query we're trying to build. And so that's where Arel again comes in, because we can say, all right, take this piece or this little snippet of Arel or SQL concept, if you will, and kind of put them all together for the final thing. And Arel handles that building behind the scenes, that putting together the SQL concepts, so to speak, and then it kind of puts it all together into the SQL that we need, right?
So I'm still a little bit disconnected from, okay, when would I use Arel? When would I use ActiveRecord?
Right. You would use ActiveRecord as much as possible. So if you're doing the kind of standard blog stuff like posts.all, post.where, whatever, right, you're definitely going to stick with ActiveRecord. But we are doing things like, so I was just talking about this like CTE idea where we're kind of step by step. We might start with, our app is all about donations. So we'll say, okay, find all the first time donors in this date range. That's like one CTE. And then the next step would be, okay, take those people and count them, turn them into counts. So I'm trying to avoid getting too much into like the actual SQL statements. Right. But one of the things you can do with a database that's usually referred to as an aggregation, you can say, so imagine you have donations that all fall on a date. They're all entered on a certain date. You can say, okay, take the month part of that and then sum the amount part.
Right. Okay.
And then group by the month, right? So then you have the sum of all donations for each month, right? But if you want, that's kind of a simple thing. But so we'll take like, okay, get all the people who gave for the first time in this month or in this time range, and then sum up all their donations by week, so say over this time range. So you're building something that might end up as a chart, right? You have the points on a graph that are the sum or the total count for a date. These are the kinds of things we're doing behind the scenes with SQL that you could build with Ruby, really. You could just stick with ActiveRecord, just pull out all the raw data and I'll iterate over it with Ruby, right? But we have what I like to say medium data. Like we don't have a massive database, but we have millions and millions of rows, about 500 gigabytes to a terabyte of data. And so we're not going to pull that all over the network and then load it into memory and then, build these counts and sums and stuff. We want to do all of that in the database. And that's where ActiveRecord has some simple concepts like sum and that kind of stuff, but we can't do these step-by-step transformation type SQL just with ActiveRecord, if that makes sense.
I actually have another example too. Yeah. So I've actually done this before too, which is why I'm like super interested in this topic myself. But I've worked on 2 different ERP systems over the course of my career. And one of them I still work on, just keep the lights on for them and things. And in this particular one, we did something like this or whatever, because so I thought it was interesting that you brought up like a filtering system. Like I felt over the course of my career, this is like the most common place that you'll get it, where you create a complex filtering system and you start to get to this point where Ransack no longer works for you. Yeah. Ransack's great, I feel like in the medium or whatever, but you get to a point where you're just like, well, if I put something in this one field right here, now I have to join another table, except that it's not just a regular join. Like maybe I have to do some aggregation on that table before I can join it, depending on what you put in the field. Or if I combine these 2 fields over here, now I have aggregations matched with aggregations. And then all of a sudden, this is where CTs are like really awesome. You're just like, okay, whenever I add this field in, I need this special CTE that like gets everything ready to combine with everything else, right?
Exactly.
And I only need to include that when I have this one field in my filter. And then you can combine multiple CTEs together. Like that's when I feel like you get into like this complex, like just figuring out how to do this stuff. And if you were to write one of these queries, you don't have to use CTEs. It's absolutely possible to write any one of these queries without CTEs. It's possible to write these queries using window functions and things like that. But trying to dynamically do it is where it gets really complicated and hard. And then CTEs are like fantastically awesome. Yeah, that's what I would say is like when you're doing something like that where you're just like where you're really like filtering something where the user gets to build up the query themselves, right? And you're kind of just trying to support that dynamic aspect of it. That's when I found that I needed to dig.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Like we have a custom search situation where people can add multiple filters, with like a nested form kind of thing. And those filters just all end up as a CTE later. And then kind of the final bit of SQL is, okay, join these things together and give me the result. And it's all dynamic. And, you're able to inject like Ruby conditional code in there as needed and all that kind of stuff. You can use Ruby is kind of where it comes down to why you would use Arel, because I want to use Ruby to conditionally and based on logic put this final SQL string together.
Yeah, your logic ends up being Ruby.
So how exactly do you use Arel then? I mean, is it basically a DSL over the top of SQL or?
Kinda. It's not too different from ActiveRecord. It's definitely different where you have to kind of learn a few things, but it's not drastically different. You can start, if you're like playing in a console or something, you can pull up one of your ActiveRecord models, like for instance, post, and do post.arel_table. And then you're like in Arel land where, okay, now I have the beginnings of the Arel node structure where I can start tacking on stuff. And from there, you could say like, there is a learning curve because you're like, some of the terms are different. You can't just say .select because that's for some reason not the word. You have to do .project, and then you can put in the columns you want and so on and so forth. So some of this is hard to kind of talk through without visuals, but
I found that when you're using this stuff, there's a lot of guessing the magic word with Arel. I wanted to do what's called a modulo lookup in Postgres, which is dead easy to do in raw SQL. But you try and find that in Arel, and it's not just that, like you said, even select is not select, it's project. Is there a big list of magic words? What do you use?
I learned how to read the source, to be honest.
That's the worst answer.
Yeah.
I think your IQ just went up about 80 points in my head.
Well,
API docs.
There are API docs, yeah. So this is where we should talk about maybe should you use SQL or should you use Arel? I guess probably the common theme in this. The documentation isn't really there because Arel is considered private API, but there is, if you Google, there's articles, there is like the Ruby doc output, that you can find and kind of get some ideas there. But I eventually just figured out how to read the source so I can really figure out what's going on. But how about this? I'll give you some tips. Sometimes
I don't want to read the source.
Yeah,
that's as bad as the only thing worse than reading the source is writing it yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, come on, Luke. I mean, honestly, it's just Ruby. It's like reading English, right?
Oh my word!
Once you get a couple of the ways that Arel works, it's actually pretty easy to read. But Arel's really trying to stick strings together.
That does not make me feel better.
That hurts so much. Okay, so I actually disagree. Okay. So let's hash this out because maybe my understanding is wrong. So my way of understanding what Arel is it's basically building an abstract syntax tree.
Yep.
Which
another thing we should define.
Yep, exactly. Right. So I'll try and go there in just a second. If you're not familiar with that, and that doesn't just like straight up ring you, we're building this gigantic graph of your query, which is, I think, so, I mean, that's basically what an abstract syntax tree is, right? Like it's basically, hey, I have, this piece, and then, hey, maybe it has a left and a right hand thing. And then I do something to go left hand, right hand, right? Well, in this case, it's like, for example, when you say, I think the easiest thing is if you're adding conditions to your where clauses, right? So if I want to say, hey, I want to find something between two dates, right? Like between has a left-hand date and a right-hand date. And so, your abstract syntax tree in Arel is going to be a between node, right? With its left-hand being, the date that's on the left-hand side and the date that's on the right-hand side, right? And so we build this tree to build this query, right? Like the string query. And it sounds like super crazy. And the thing that I was going to try and get to is I think the issue with Arel is it's very hard to conceive of for most people, in my experience, to conceive of your query, which is just a string to almost everybody. And I think SQL is hard for a lot of people in the first place.
Right.
But then to abstract at another level and say, hey, I'm going to build this gigantic tree just so that I can get my computer to dynamically build this for me. Like you have multiple levels of abstractions that are hard.
Yep.
And I think that's the main challenge actually with Arel at its core.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. That's like a hard thing to keep in your head. And if you're in a console and you output the data structure of an Arel thing, it's like pages and pages of these little nodes, little node objects. And I kind of try to skip that and ignore it. And then I look at the individual node classes and think, so what started us down this trail was your question about how do I figure out what to do? And oftentimes you can use this Arel node called a named function. So you could say, if the SQL you want is a word with parentheses and an argument or a list of arguments to that, then I just reach for this thing called named function, and it builds that thing, right? So I'm going to say, here's the name of the thing, here's the arguments to it. Just kind of figure it out. It works out, right? Almost 8 times out of 10, I would say that's the SQL I want. And then there's some other nodes that I've used to hack together when it's something really weird that I want to do. But yeah, it's definitely a complex thing, but you kind of muddle through it.
Yeah, one tip I'm going to throw out on this is one website that I really love for getting an idea of what an abstract syntax tree looks like is astexplorer.net. And it defaults to JavaScript, but you can choose other languages, and one of them is SQL.
Okay.
And so then you can kind of look at it. And the way that I would recommend that you look at it is essentially you go in and, switch it over to SQL, and then it will break it down into the AST. And what I want you to do, and you can switch it over. It has a tree view and a JSON view. So look at the JSON view. And then from there, just kind of look at it from the standpoint of, if I had to parse a messy string versus parsing this really nice object that breaks it down into a standard way, I'd much rather write a program that did the right thing off of this really nice object that I've got sitting here.
Right. I think another way to think of it is to define abstract syntax tree backwards. It's first of all, it's a tree. It's a data structure. It's a pile of data. And then it's syntax. It's the language for the computer or some kind of compiler, right? And then it's abstract in that it separates the idea that you're trying to accomplish, the thing you're trying to accomplish, from the implementation of that idea. And that's what Arel does. Is it builds up this abstract syntax tree, and at that point, like you were saying, Charles, it's okay, now we can write a program to translate those ideas into whatever we need. And so then under the hood, Arel takes that abstract syntax tree and uses another fancy computer science term, the visitor pattern, which is basically just a visitor is an object that is going to look at this tree and do the specific thing for its specific purpose, right? So Arel has a Postgres visitor, it has a MySQL visitor, there's a Microsoft SQL server visitors, IBM database, every different database has its own visitor. So that visitor knows, okay, I see this node. For example, if you say, I want to limit my results to 5 rows, limit 5. In MySQL and Postgres, that SQL is limit 5. But in other databases, it might be take 5 or top 5. Or, there might be there's different SQL there, right? So the visitor goes, okay, for me, I'm going to take that limit node, or that, I forget exactly what it is under the hood, but that limit idea, and I'm going to translate it into the database specific SQL for what I'm doing. So between those, if you can get through those two concepts, then I think, okay, I kind of get what Arel is doing in the source. It's okay, this half of the code is about turning the nodes into actual SQL strings, and the other half is about building that node structure, that big tree.
So I have one question / criticism about Arel.
Okay.
Is that if they've gone through all the effort of building these tie-ins to the various databases and it's available in Arel, why isn't it available in ActiveRecord?
I think so I don't know. We would have to ask the Rails course team, but my speculation is that it's harder to move some of these concepts up into the layer of abstraction that ActiveRecord lives in, right? It's that really nice ergonomic world, and then at the bottom is the unergonomic world of SQL, right? And in between is kind of with Arel, and it's like it seems to me like over the years that the core team has done their best to get that Arel layer nice, but they have until recently, I would say, they've said, we're not taking bug requests for Arel because it is what it is. They consider it private API. So like if Rails changed how has many worked, right? You better believe there would be blog posts and deprecation warnings and all this kind of cycle to get everybody ready. Hey, this thing that everybody uses is going to change soon. But between versions, Arel, there's no warning, right? Between major Rails versions. So, and that's what they mean when they say it's like private API. I've talked to a couple of the Rails core team people about it. It's like, is it wrong to use Arel? Do you not want people to use Arel, or do you, and they're kind of like, well, it's there and absolutely use it, but use it with the understanding that you're responsible for it in a bigger sense than you would be for your ActiveRecord code. It's not that it's not tested or it's going to break, but it's more your responsibility to make sure, like between versions, that what you're expecting out of it is what you're expecting out of it, right? So we test every bit of Arel code that we write, and a couple times when we move between versions, there's like white space changes, right? I'm like, okay, that's pretty easy to figure out, or we always catch it because we're always testing all the Arel code, but we have to adapt to move Arel. We have a lot of Arel in our app. That probably wouldn't be the same for everybody, but as we've upgraded Rails, we've had to make a few little changes.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there. The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
It is pretty stable.
Yeah.
I might add, I don't think that Eric's warning should seem
it
scary.
shouldn't be too scary. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty stable. For the most part, my experience over the years with it has just been that they just keep adding features, not that they break stuff.
Right. Yeah. So it's not that it's prone to break. It's just that things change in little ways, and so you want to test it. But if you have reasonable test coverage on it, I think you can be confident in using Arel. But recently they said, at least on the Ruby on Rails Discord forum, that they're looking to make it more of a, for lack of a better word, public thing where people use it more and more, and they're trying to improve the ergonomics in around Arel and that kind of stuff. It's just if you've written a gem or anything like that, you've got a lot of implementation details that you're like, I wish this was a little nicer, but for the time being, it works, right?
So there's some interesting things, partly to answer your question, Dave. I've been trying really hard since we started this to come up with something. Window clauses, I think, are a really good example of something that doesn't really fit. It would be really hard to do that using Rails's ActiveRecord syntaxes. I mean, I suppose there's possibly a way to do it, but I can't think of one off the top of my head, right? But that's an awkward one to do no matter what. And I think features like that you have in SQL that Arel has implemented, I think might be hard to bring up.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but
one of the things that's changed recently, like Rails 6, you used to have, if you were going to do an upsert, it was very database specific. I should define upsert. So you can tell some databases, hey, I want to insert this record, but if it's already there based on ID or some other information, then just update a couple of the columns in it, right? So it's like a insert, but if it's already there, update, right? And normally with ActiveRecord,